I'm going to share some secrets with you now. Secrets that the wealthy don't share, because they're the only ones who think they can use bank credit cards and cheat the system. A system that doesn't let people get rich. Those who understand this are one step ahead of others who use it like a regular card and then pay interest to the bank. Let's make a bet. If I share some interesting information with you that you didn't know before, you must write a comment explaining what exactly was a revelation for you. And now, hit that like, subscribe, and let's dive deeper into the topic of our audiobook. Most people spend their entire lives afraid of something they were never taught to understand. Debt. They hear the word, and they feel tension in their chest. They imagine stress, pressure, bills stacking up. They imagine being trapped. And so they do what they were told. Avoid it. Fear it. Stay away from it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. While you've been running from debt, someone else has been using it to build empires. And that difference, that single misunderstanding, is why one person struggles for decades and another quietly becomes financially unstoppable. In this audiobook, Use Credit Cards as Tools, How to Make the Bank Work for You, you're going to uncover a shift that changes everything. Not hype, not shortcuts, not reckless borrowing. This is about awareness, because debt itself is not dangerous. Misunderstood debt is. And once you understand how the system actually works, you stop being controlled by it, and you start using it. Over the next chapters, you'll discover how the wealthy think about credit differently, why banks favor those who already have money, how leverage quietly multiplies power, the psychology that separates consumers from controllers, and how to turn financial pressure into financial positioning. This is not financial advice. This is education, awareness, strategy. Because the system was never designed to be fair. It was designed to reward those who understand it. And here's a line you need to hear early. The system doesn't trap people. It reveals who understands it. So ask yourself, have you been avoiding the game, or have you simply never been shown how it's played? Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And chapter 1 begins with the most dangerous lie you've ever been told about money. Chapter 1. The lie about debt. You were taught something early, maybe not directly, but through tone, through warnings, through fear. Stay out of debt. Credit cards are dangerous. Loans will ruin your life. And on the surface, that advice sounds responsible, but it's incomplete, because it doesn't tell you why some people drown in debt, while others use it like a ladder. Think about this. If debt is inherently bad, why do the most powerful corporations on the planet use billions of it? Why do billionaires finance assets instead of paying cash? Why do banks aggressively offer loans? Not to the struggling, but to the already wealthy. Pause there. Because that question alone should shake something in you. The truth is simple, but uncomfortable. There are two types of debt. One that shrinks you, and one that expands you. Most people only ever experience the first. They borrow to consume, to buy things that lose value, to fund lifestyles they haven't earned yet. And every month, their future gets tighter. But there is another path, a quieter one, a more strategic one, where debt is not used to impress, but to acquire, to control, to position. The difference is not intelligence, it's awareness. The people who struggle with debt were never taught how to direct it. They were only taught to fear it, and fear creates avoidance. Avoidance creates ignorance. Ignorance creates mistakes. That cycle repeats, generation after generation. But once you break it, once you see debt not as a burden, but as a tool, everything changes. Because tools are neutral. A hammer can build a house or destroy a wall. It depends on the hands holding it. And right now, most people are holding financial tools without ever being shown how to use them. Let's make it even clearer. A person uses a credit card to buy clothes, gadgets, and experiences. At the end of the month, they owe money. Nothing they bought produces income, so they pay interest. They lose. Now imagine someone else. They use borrowed money to acquire something that generates cash. A small business, a digital asset, a property, a system that produces value. Now the debt is still there, but something else exists alongside it. Income. Now the equation changes. Now the debt is being carried, not by the person, but by the asset. And that is the shift. The quiet, powerful shift. You move from being the one who pays to the one who positions. This is why the wealthy don't ask, "How much does this cost me monthly?" They ask, "What does this produce annually?" One question shrinks your world. The other expands it. And once you start asking better questions, you start seeing different opportunities. Because the truth is, money follows clarity. And clarity begins when you stop thinking like a consumer. Consumers react. Investors calculate. Consumers chase comfort. Investors chase control. Consumers look at price. Investors look at return. And until that shift happens internally, no external strategy will save you. Because the problem was never money. It was perspective. Now here's where it gets deeper. Because even when people hear this, they hesitate. Not because it doesn't make sense, but because it challenges what they believed for years. And that discomfort, that internal resistance, is exactly where transformation begins. You don't change your financial life overnight. You change the way you see it. And then your actions follow. So, before we go any further, ask yourself honestly, have I been using money or reacting to it? Because in the next chapter, we're going to break down the invisible line that separates those who stay stuck from those who quietly build power. And once you see it, you'll realize it was never about how much you earn. It was about how you think. Dear viewers, write which city you're from. It's interesting to see which corners of the world are watching our videos. Chapter 2. The Two Worlds of Borrowers. There are two worlds that exist at the same time, but most people never realize they're standing at the edge of both. One world is loud. You can see it everywhere. People upgrading phones they don't need, cars they can't afford, vacations they post, but quietly pay off for years. It looks like progress, but underneath, it's pressure, monthly payments, growing balances, a quiet weight that follows them everywhere. This is the world of reactive borrowing, where money is used to escape discomfort, not to build control. And then there's the second world. It's quieter. You won't see it on social media. You won't hear people talking about it loudly because it doesn't need attention. It produces results. In this world, debt is not emotional. It's calculated. It's deliberate. It's strategic. The people in this world don't ask, "Can I afford this?" They ask, "Will this pay for itself and more?" That question alone separates two entirely different lives. Let's slow this down, because this is where everything begins to shift. In the first world, people borrow to feel better. In the second world, People borrow to become stronger. That's it. Same tool, different intention, and intention shapes outcome. Now here's what most people never notice. The bank doesn't care which world you're in. They will lend to both, but they profit from one and partner with the other. That's the part no one explains. When someone borrows emotionally, the bank becomes their master. Interest grows. Stress grows. Control disappears. But when someone borrows strategically, the bank becomes their silent partner. The money is still borrowed, but now it's directed. And direction changes everything, because money without direction creates chaos. Money with direction creates leverage, and leverage, that's where power lives. Let's make this real. Imagine two people. Both take a loan for the same amount. The first uses it to upgrade their lifestyle. Better car, better clothes, better image. For a moment, they feel ahead, but nothing they bought returns anything. So every month, they must work to pay back the past. Now imagine the second person, same amount, but they use it differently. They invest into something that produces. Maybe it's a skill that increases income. Maybe it's a small business. Maybe it's something digital, something scalable. Now, every month, the loan still exists, but so does income. And slowly, the pressure shifts. Because now the debt is not sitting on their shoulders. It's being carried by what they built. That's the invisible difference. One person is paying for the past. The other is building the future. And here's the line you need to remember. Debt either consumes your life or compounds your leverage. There is no neutral. And the moment you understand that, you stop asking emotional questions. You start asking strategic ones. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable again. Because most people don't stay in the first world by accident. They stay there because it's easier. It requires less thinking, less discipline, less patience. You don't need a plan to spend money. You don't need strategy to impress people. But you do need discipline to delay comfort. You do need awareness to think long term. And that's where most people fall. Not because they can't understand it, but because they've never trained themselves to think that way. And this is where mindset enters the game. Because money decisions are never just financial. They're psychological. Every purchase, every loan, every swipe, it's a reflection of how you think. And if your thinking is reactive, your results will be reactive. But if your thinking becomes intentional, your entire financial reality begins to shift. This is why the real work is not just learning about money, it's learning about yourself. Because the same discipline that builds your mindset builds your financial life. The same focus that shapes your habits, shapes your outcomes, and the same awareness that controls your emotions, controls your decisions. That's why people who master themselves eventually master money. Not the other way around. So before you even think about using credit as a tool, you need to ask yourself something deeper. Am I reacting to life, or am I directing it? Because in the next chapter, we're going to uncover something even more powerful. The concept that quietly separates slow growth from exponential growth. And once you understand it, you will never look at time or money the same way again. Chapter 3, Leverage, the invisible multiplier. There is a force in this world that most people never truly understand. They see its effects, but they don't recognize its cause. They see someone grow faster, scale faster, move faster, and they assume it's talent, luck, connections. But underneath it all, there is something else. Leverage. Leverage is the quiet multiplier. It is the reason one person spends 30 years building something, while another builds it in 5. It is the difference between effort and amplified effort. And once you understand it, you stop trying to do everything alone. You start positioning yourself to do more with less. Let's make it simple. Without leverage, your growth is tied directly to your time. You work 1 hour, you earn 1 result. You work 10 hours, you earn 10 results. That's linear, that's slow, that's exhausting. Now introduce leverage. Now your time is no longer the only input. Now you have systems, tools, other people's money, other people's resources. Now 1 hour can produce 10 results, or 100, or more. That's exponential. And this is exactly where debt becomes misunderstood. Because debt, when used correctly, is leverage. It is not just borrowed money. It is borrowed acceleration. It is the ability to control something bigger than your current capacity. And that is where the game changes. Because think about this. If you had to rely only on what you personally saved, how long would it take you to build something significant? Years, decades. But with leverage, you are no longer limited by your current position. You can step into opportunities before you fully own them. And that's uncomfortable for most people because they were taught to feel safe, to only act when everything is certain, to only move when they have full control. But here's the truth. Full control is an illusion, and waiting for perfect conditions is the fastest way to stay stuck. The people who understand leverage don't wait. They calculate, they measure risk against opportunity, and then they move, not recklessly, but decisively, because they understand something most people don't. Time is the most expensive thing you will ever spend, not money, time. And leverage is how you compress time. It's how you take something that would take 20 years and bring it into 5. Now let's ground this even deeper. Imagine someone trying to build wealth without leverage. They save money slowly. They invest small amounts. They grow, but gradually. Now imagine someone using leverage correctly. They identify an opportunity that produces value. They don't wait 10 years to afford it fully. They position themselves using borrowed capital. Now they control something bigger, sooner. And as that asset grows, it pays back the debt and builds equity. Now they are not just growing, they are accelerating. That's the difference. And this is why the wealthy don't fear leverage. They respect it. They understand its weight, but they also understand its power. Because leverage is not dangerous, misused leverage is. And here's where most people go wrong. They hear about leverage, but they skip the foundation. They want acceleration without direction. They want growth without discipline. And that combination is where things collapse, because leverage amplifies everything, not just success. If your thinking is weak, leverage will amplify your mistakes. If your decisions are emotional, leverage will magnify the damage. But if your thinking is clear, if your decisions are strategic, leverage becomes a force multiplier for everything you touch. So the real question is not, should I use leverage? The real question is, am I ready to handle what leverage amplifies? Because it will expose everything, your habits, your discipline, your awareness. It will either elevate you or reveal you. And that's why most people avoid it. Not because it doesn't work, but because it demands a higher level of thinking, a higher level of control. a higher level of responsibility. And here's the shift you need to make. Stop asking, how do I avoid risk? Start asking, how do I manage it intelligently? Because risk is not something you eliminate. It's something you navigate. And the people who win are not the ones who avoid risk completely. They are the ones who understand it better than everyone else. They move with awareness. They move with intention. They don't gamble. They position. And when you reach that level, debt stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like a tool, a controlled force, a strategic advantage. Now pause for a second, because this is where your thinking begins to stretch. You are no longer just learning about money. You are learning about control, about positioning, about how the same system that traps most people can be used to elevate you. But there's another layer to this, a deeper one. Because even with leverage, even with strategy, most people still stay stuck, not because they lack information, but because they never shift their identity. And in the next chapter, we're going to break that open, because until you stop seeing yourself as a consumer, you will never fully step into control. And once that identity shifts, everything else begins to align. Friend, write your opinion on this topic in the comments. Do you agree with us or not? I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Chapter 4. The Identity Shift. From consumer to controller. Before money changes in your life, your identity must change first. Because everything you do financially is a reflection of who you believe you are. Not who you say you are, not who you want to be, but who you operate as every single day. And this is where most people get stuck. They try to apply advanced strategies with a basic mindset. They try to use powerful tools with weak habits. And when it doesn't work, they blame the system. But the truth is, the system didn't fail them. They never changed the way they see themselves inside it. Let's go deeper. A consumer mindset is not about income. It's about orientation. Consumers move toward comfort. They spend to feel better, to look better, to escape. They measure life in experiences, not outcomes. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying life. But when enjoyment becomes the priority, growth disappears, because consumers ask one dominant question: what can I enjoy right now? And that question keeps them trapped in cycles. Now contrast that with a controller mindset. A controller doesn't move toward comfort. They move toward positioning. They delay gratification, not because they hate enjoyment, but because they understand timing. They don't just ask what something costs. They ask what it does. They don't just look at money as something to spend. They see it as something to direct. That's the shift. And it's subtle, but powerful. Because once you stop seeing money as something you use and start seeing it as something you deploy, your entire behavior changes. Now every decision becomes intentional. Now every move has purpose. Now you are no longer reacting. You are designing. And this is exactly why most people never fully use credit as a tool. Because tools require intention, and intention requires identity. If you still see yourself as someone who gets by, you will always use money to survive. If you see yourself as someone who builds, you start using money to expand. That internal shift is where everything begins. Now here's something even deeper. Most people don't realize their financial behavior was programmed early, through what they saw growing up, through what they heard repeatedly, through fear, through limitation, and that programming runs quietly in the background. It shows up when you hesitate, when you doubt, when you avoid. It shows up when you say things like, I can't afford that. That's too risky. That's not for people like me. And those phrases, they don't just describe your reality. They reinforce it, because the mind works in patterns. And if your pattern is limitation, you will keep creating it. That's why breaking out financially is never just about money. It's about awareness. You have to see the pattern before you can change it. You have to question the belief before you can replace it. And you have to decide who you are becoming, because identity is not fixed. It's built day by day, decision by decision. And every time you choose discipline over impulse, you strengthen that new identity. Every time you delay gratification, you reinforce control. Every time you think long-term, you step further away from the consumer mindset and closer to something more powerful. Now let's bring this back to credit, because this is where the difference becomes real. A consumer uses a credit card like an extension of income. A controller uses it like an instrument. A consumer sees a limit and thinks spending power. A controller sees a limit and thinks capacity. Capacity for what? Opportunity, positioning, timing, because when you understand how to control money, credit stops being emotional. It becomes tactical. You don't swipe randomly. You deploy intentionally. You don't chase rewards. You build systems. You don't think about today. You think about leverage over time. And here's the line that defines everything in this chapter. Your financial life will never rise above the identity you operate from. So if you want to change your results, you must first change your standard, not what you want, but what you accept. Because once your standard shifts, your actions follow naturally. You don't have to force discipline. It becomes who you are. You don't have to remind yourself to think long-term. It becomes automatic. And this is where true control begins, not in your bank account, but in your mind. Now here's the challenge, and it's a real one, because changing identity is uncomfortable. It requires letting go of habits that feel familiar. It requires stepping into decisions that feel uncertain. It requires becoming someone you've never been before. But that's the price of growth, because staying the same costs more. And in the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper into something most people completely overlook: the psychology of banks. Because once you understand how they actually see you, you will realize why some people are constantly approved, while others are constantly denied. And more importantly, how to position yourself on the side that gets access. Chapter 5. How Banks Really See You. You think the bank is evaluating your income. That's what most people believe. They think approval is based on how much they earn, how stable their job is, how safe they look on paper. But that's not the full picture, not even close, because banks are not emotional. They don't care about your story. They don't care about your effort. They don't care how hard you work. They care about one thing: predictability. Not how much you make, but how reliably you operate. And once you understand that, you stop trying to impress the bank, and you start positioning yourself correctly. Let's break this down. When a bank looks at you, they are not asking, is this person good? They are asking, is this person predictable? Because predictable behavior means manageable risk, and manageable risk means profit. Now here's where it gets interesting. The people who struggle most with credit often think they are being responsible. They avoid credit. They don't borrow. They stay away from the system, and in their mind, that feels safe. But to the bank, it looks invisible. No history, no data, no pattern. And what the bank cannot measure, it cannot trust. So they hesitate. They deny. Not because you're incapable, but because you're unknown. Now contrast that with someone who understands the system. They don't avoid credit. They manage it. They use it, but with control. They borrow, but strategically. They repay consistently and over time. They build a pattern, a track record, a financial identity that says this person understands how to handle capital. And that is what the bank responds to. Not effort, not intention, behavior. Because behavior creates data, and data drives decisions. So when people say the system is unfair, what they often mean is, I don't understand how I'm being evaluated, and once you understand that, you stop taking it personally. You start taking control. Now, here's another layer most people miss. Banks don't make money from wealthy people the same way they make money from struggling people. Let that sink in. From the outside, it looks like the bank is helping the wealthy. Lower interest rates, higher limits, better offers. But it's not generosity, it's strategy. Because the wealthy are predictable. They move with structure. They manage risk. And that makes them valuable clients. So the bank competes for them. But with the average borrower, the dynamic is different. Higher risk, less consistency, more emotional decisions. So the bank protects itself, higher interest, stricter terms, and suddenly the same system feels completely different, depending on how you operate inside it. That's not random, that's design. Now here's the shift you need to make. Stop seeing the bank as something above you. Start seeing it as a system you can learn. Because once you understand how it works, you stop feeling controlled by it. You start interacting with it strategically. You begin to realize it's not about fighting the system. It's about aligning with it and using it. Because the bank is not your enemy, but it's not your friend either. It's a tool, a structured system, designed to reward certain behaviors, and if you learn those behaviors, you gain access. Access to capital, access to opportunity, access to leverage. And that's where everything opens up. Now think about this. Two people walk into the same bank. One gets denied. The other gets approved instantly. Same environment. Different outcome. Why? Because one has positioned themselves as predictable and the other hasn't. That's it. And that's powerful because it means approval is not random. It's built over time, through consistency, through awareness, through intentional action. Now here's the deeper truth. The bank is always watching, not in a negative way, but in a data-driven way. Every payment, every delay, every pattern, it all feeds into a profile, and that profile determines your access. So the question becomes, what profile are you building? Are you building one of reaction or one of control? Because that profile will determine what doors open for you in the future. And here's the line you need to remember from this chapter. The bank doesn't trust your intentions. It trusts your patterns. So, if you want more access, you don't need to ask for it. You need to build for it. Now take a breath, because this is where things start to connect. You've seen the mindset shift, you've seen leverage, you've seen identity, and now you're beginning to understand the system itself. But there's still something missing, because even with access, even with leverage, even with understanding, most people still fail to build anything meaningful, not because they don't have tools, but because they misuse them. And in the next chapter, we're going to break down the most common mistake people make with credit cards, the one that keeps them stuck even when they think they're moving forward. Chapter 6, The Credit Card Trap. Most people never see. Most people think they understand credit cards. They think the danger is obvious: high interest, minimum payments, overspending. And yes, those are real. But the real trap is much quieter, much more subtle, and far more dangerous, because it doesn't feel like a mistake until it's already built a pattern. Let's go deeper. The biggest mistake people make with credit cards is not overspending. It's misidentifying what the card actually is. They treat it like extra money, but it's not. It's delayed responsibility, and that delay creates illusion. Because when you swipe a card, nothing leaves your account immediately. There's no pain, no resistance, no friction, and that's where the problem begins. Because the brain associates spending with emotion. And when there's no immediate consequence, the brain relaxes. It justifies. It rationalizes. This is fine. I'll handle it later. It's not that much. And slowly, without noticing, you start building a habit, a dangerous one, where spending becomes disconnected from reality. Now here's where it gets deeper, because the card itself is not the problem. The lack of awareness is, because when used correctly, a credit card is not a spending tool. It's a tracking tool, a positioning tool, a leverage tool. But most people never reach that level because they stay in emotional mode. They swipe based on feeling, not strategy. They react to desire, not intention, and every swipe reinforces the same loop. Short-term satisfaction, long-term pressure. Now let's break the illusion completely. A credit card does not increase your wealth. It increases your exposure. It magnifies your behavior. If you are disciplined, it amplifies your structure. If you are impulsive, it amplifies your chaos. And that's why two people can use the same card and end up in completely different realities. One builds control, the other builds debt. Same tool, different mind. Now think about this. Why do credit card companies offer rewards, cashback, points, bonuses? It feels like a benefit, like you're gaining something. But in reality, it's behavioral engineering. They are rewarding usage. Because the more you use, the more data they collect, the more patterns they see, the more predictable you become. And if that usage is emotional, they profit. If it's controlled, you benefit. That's the balance. Now here's the shift you need to make. Stop asking, how much can I spend? Start asking, what is the purpose of this transaction? Because purpose changes everything. If there is no clear reason, there should be no action. And this is where discipline enters again. Because discipline is not restriction, it's direction. It's the ability to say, this does not serve me, even when it feels good in the moment. And that's hard, because the world around you is built to trigger impulse, ads, social media, comparison. Everything is designed to make you feel like you need more. And a credit card becomes the bridge between desire and action. But here's the truth. Most people avoid. Just because you can buy something doesn't mean you should. That one realization can save years of struggle. Now let's flip this completely. What does a disciplined credit card user look like? They don't swipe randomly. They plan. They don't chase rewards. They optimize. They don't carry balances. They manage flow. They treat every transaction as part of a system, not an isolated decision, because Isolated decisions create chaos. Systems create control. And once you build a system, the card stops being dangerous. It becomes predictable, useful, strategic. Now here's a powerful reframing. A credit card is not a shortcut. It's a mirror. It reflects your habits, your discipline, your awareness. And if you don't like what it reflects, the answer is not to remove the mirror. It's to change what it shows. That's growth, that's control, that's maturity. And here's the line that defines this chapter. A credit card doesn't create your problems, it exposes them. So instead of avoiding it, learn to master it. Because the same tool that traps most people can become one of your greatest advantages, but only if you step out of emotion and into intention. Now take a moment, because everything you've learned so far is building toward something bigger. We've broken the myths, we've shifted identity, we've exposed the system. But now, it's time to move from understanding to application, because knowledge without action changes nothing. And in the next chapter, we're going to break down exactly how to start using credit cards as tools in a way that builds control instead of pressure. This is where theory becomes practice, and where most people finally begin to separate themselves from the average. Chapter 7. Using credit cards as tools, the first real system. Now we move from awareness into control, because everything you've heard so far means nothing if it doesn't change how you act. This is where most people stop. They understand the idea, they feel motivated, they agree with the logic, but they never build a system. And without a system, you fall back into old patterns. So let's build something real. Something simple, but powerful. Because using a credit card as a tool is not about complexity. It's about structure. The first rule is this: your credit card is not for spending. It is for managing flow. That shift alone changes everything. Because spending is emotional. Flow is strategic. Now let's break that down. Most people treat their debit card as real money and their credit card as flexible money. That's backwards, because the disciplined user does the opposite. They treat every credit card transaction as if the money already left their account. No delay, no illusion. The moment they swipe, they already know where the repayment is coming from. That's control. Now here's the structure. Simple, clear, non-negotiable. You only use your credit card. For expenses you could already pay in cash. Read that again, because this is where most people break the system. They use credit to extend beyond their reality, instead of organizing what already exists. And that's what creates pressure. But when you reverse it, when you only charge what you already have, the card becomes a buffer, a layer of organization, a way to track, optimize, and position your money, not stretch it. Now here's the second rule. Every swipe must have a category, not mentally. Clearly, you must know, was this essential? Was this productive? Was this unnecessary? Because clarity creates awareness, and awareness creates control. When everything blends together, you lose visibility. And when you lose visibility, you lose direction. Now here's where it becomes powerful. When you start categorizing your spending, you start seeing patterns. You see where money leaks. You see where it grows. You see where it disappears. And once you see it, you can adjust it. That's the difference between reacting and managing. Now the third rule. You never carry a balance you don't control. Notice the wording. Not never carry a balance, but never carry one you don't control. Because, again, debt itself is not the enemy. Uncontrolled debt is. If you are carrying a balance, it must be intentional, planned, connected to something that serves a purpose, not random, not emotional, not reactive. Because once you lose control, the system flips, and now the card is using you instead of you using it. Now here's a powerful concept. You are not trying to eliminate debt completely. You are trying to eliminate unproductive debt. There is a difference, because productive debt has direction. It is tied to something that builds. Unproductive debt has no return. It only consumes. And once you learn to separate those two, you stop feeling guilt around money. You start feeling clarity. Now let's bring this into real life. You use your credit card for necessary expenses, groceries, bills, things you would already pay for. But instead of paying immediately, you channel everything through one system. Now you have one place to track, one place to manage, one place to optimize. And at the end of the cycle, you clear it fully. Not partially, not emotionally, but systematically. And what does that do? It builds history, it builds predictability, it builds trust with the system, and over time, it increases your access, higher limits, better terms, more flexibility. And now, you are not just using money. You are building positioning. That's the long game. Now here's where discipline becomes critical again. Because this system only works if you respect it. You cannot mix emotional spending into it. You cannot justify unnecessary decisions. You cannot lie to yourself, because the system will expose it every time. And that's the truth most people avoid. They don't fail because the system is hard. They fail because they don't stay consistent. They break their own rules. They negotiate with impulse. They tell themselves, just this once. And that's where control slips. Because discipline is not tested when things are easy. It's tested when temptation is present. When it would feel good to break the rule, when no one would notice, that's when it matters. And that's what separates those who build control from those who stay stuck. Now here's the deeper realization. Using a credit card as a tool is not about the card. It's about who you become while using it. More aware, more disciplined, more intentional. Because those traits extend far beyond money. They shape your entire life. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself honestly, have I been using systems, or have I been operating on impulse? Because in the next chapter, we're going to take this even further into something most people never consider. How to begin using debt, not just to manage life, but to actually expand it. This is where the conversation shifts from control to growth. And once you step into that level, you will never look at loans the same way again. If you appreciate our efforts and our thoughts, subscribe and like this video. We need to show the world that there are many people like us. We must always continue to improve. Chapter 8, From Control to Expansion. When debt starts working for you, most people stop at control. They learn how to manage money. They reduce mistakes. They stabilize their situation, and that's where they stay. Safe, predictable, but still limited. Because control alone does not create wealth. It creates stability. And stability is important. But it is not the destination. It's the foundation. And this is where the next shift happens. From control to expansion. Because once you stop leaking money, once you stop reacting, you create something powerful. Capacity. And capacity is what allows you to move. Now here's the truth most people never hear. You don't use debt to survive. You use debt to expand. That's the difference between staying in place and stepping forward. Let's slow this down, because this is where fear usually shows up again. The moment people hear, use debt to grow, they hesitate. They think, that sounds risky. What if it goes wrong? What if I lose? And those are valid questions. But they come from a place of protection, not positioning. Because remember, risk is not eliminated. It's managed. And when you've already built control, when you've already trained discipline, when you already understand the system, now you are in a different position. Now you're not guessing, you're evaluating, and that changes everything. Now let's make this real. Imagine you've built a stable base. Your expenses are managed, your habits are controlled, your financial behavior is consistent. Now instead of just maintaining, you begin to look outward. You begin to ask, where can I place money so that it returns more? That question is the beginning of expansion, because now money is no longer something you protect. It becomes something you deploy, and that's a completely different mindset. Now here's where debt enters again, but this time, not as pressure, as opportunity. Because when you identify something that produces value, something that can generate income, you don't always need to wait until you have full capital. You can position, you can leverage, you can step in earlier. And that early positioning is what creates acceleration, because opportunity rarely waits for perfect timing. It rewards readiness. Now here's the key. You do not use debt randomly. You use it where there is clear direction, clear potential, clear reasoning, not hype, not emotion, not guessing. Because this is where most people fail again. They hear about using loans, but they skip the thinking, they jump into action without structure, and that's where mistakes happen. So let's define this clearly. You only use debt for expansion when three things are present: clarity, control, capacity. Clarity. You understand what you're entering. Control. Your current system is stable. Capacity. You can handle pressure if needed. If one of these is missing, you wait. Not out of fear, but out of intelligence, because timing matters, and disciplined patience is just as powerful as action. Now here's a powerful perspective shift. Most people think debt creates pressure, but in reality, unplanned debt creates pressure. Planned debt creates direction, because when you choose it intentionally, you know why it exists. You know what it's connected to. You know what outcome you're working toward. And that removes chaos. Now let's go even deeper. Why do the wealthy consistently use borrowed money? Not because they lack cash, but because they understand something critical. They preserve their capital and deploy other people's. Think about that. Instead of tying up their own resources, they use leverage. They keep flexibility. They maintain liquidity. And they position themselves for multiple opportunities at the same time. That's advanced thinking. But it starts with simple awareness. You don't need to be wealthy to think like that. You just need to understand the principle. Because once you do, you stop seeing loans as limitations. You start seeing them as tools. Not always, not everywhere, but in the right situations, at the right time. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. Debt used without direction creates stress. Debt used with intention creates expansion. And once you feel that difference, you stop fearing the concept. You start respecting it. Now take a breath, because this is where your mindset begins to stretch again. You're no longer just managing life. You're beginning to shape it. You're beginning to see possibilities. instead of just limitations. But there's still a missing piece, because even with expansion, even with leverage, most people still struggle to build something sustainable, not because they lack tools, but because they don't understand one critical principle: cash flow. And in the next chapter, we're going to break that open. Because once you understand cash flow, you stop chasing money and start controlling how it moves. And that is where real power begins. Chapter 9, Cash Flow, the lifeblood of control. Most people think wealth is about how much money you have. They focus on the number, the balance, the amount sitting in an account. But that's not where real power comes from, because money sitting still does nothing. It doesn't grow, it doesn't expand, it doesn't create momentum, it just waits. And while it waits, time moves, opportunity moves, the world moves. And this is where most people misunderstand everything, because wealth is not built on static money. It's built on movement. Cash flow. Cash flow is not how much you have. It's how money moves through your life, how it enters, how it exits, how it cycles, and most importantly, whether it returns. Because here's the truth. You can have a high income and still be broke. You can earn more than most people and still feel pressure every single month. Why? Because income without structure is chaos. Money comes in and disappears just as fast. No direction, no system, no control. Now contrast that with someone who understands cash flow. They don't just focus on earning, they focus on circulation. They build systems where money moves and returns again and again. That's the difference. Now let's connect this back to debt, because this is where everything becomes real. Debt without cash flow is weight. Debt with cash flow is leverage. And that single difference determines everything. Let's make this clear. If you take on debt and there is no system feeding it, no return connected to it, no structure supporting it, then yes, it becomes pressure. It becomes something you must carry. But if that same debt is tied to movement, if it's connected to something that generates, something that produces, something that feeds back into the system, now it becomes part of a cycle. Now it supports itself. And that is where the shift happens, from burden to engine. Now here's where most people get stuck. They think cash flow requires something big, a massive business, a large investment, a perfect opportunity. But that's not true. Cash flow starts small. It starts with awareness, with tracking, with understanding where your money is going and why. Because if you cannot control small flows, you cannot manage large ones. And this is where discipline shows up again. Because tracking money is not exciting, it's not flashy, it doesn't give immediate rewards, but it gives something more valuable: clarity. And clarity is power. Because once you see your flow clearly, you can adjust it, you can redirect it, you can optimize it. Now let's go deeper. Most people live in a cycle like this: earn, spend, repeat. There is no return loop. Money enters and leaves permanently. That's a one-way system, and one-way systems always lead to pressure. But when you understand cash flow, you start building loops: earn, deploy, return, repeat. Now money doesn't just leave, it comes back, and every time it returns, it brings something with it: more capacity, more flexibility, more opportunity. That's how growth begins, not from one big moment, but from consistent cycles. Now here's the powerful connection. When you combine cash flow with leverage, everything accelerates. Because now you're not just using your own money, you're using systems, you're using structure, you're using movement, and movement creates momentum, and momentum is what builds real wealth. Now pause for a second, because this is where your thinking expands again. You stop asking, how much money do I have? And you start asking, how does my money move? Because movement reveals everything. It shows you where you're strong. It shows you where you're leaking. It shows you where you're stuck. And once you see it, you can change it. Now here's the line you need to remember from this chapter. Wealth is not built by what you keep. It's built by what you circulate intelligently. And that idea alone can change how you approach everything, because now you're not hoarding money. You're directing it. Now you're not reacting. You're designing. Now you're not stuck in survival. You're stepping into control. But here's where it gets even deeper. Because even with cash flow, even with leverage, even with understanding, most people still hesitate. They hesitate to act. They hesitate to move. They hesitate to step forward, not because they lack knowledge, but because they fear mistakes. And in the next chapter, we're going to break that fear, because mistakes are not what hold people back. Misinterpreting mistakes is. And once you understand that, you will move differently, faster, smarter, with more confidence. Chapter 10. Mistakes, the hidden advantage. Most people misread. Most people are not afraid of failure. They are afraid of what failure means about them. That's the real fear, not the loss, not the mistake, not even the setback, but the story they attach to it. I'm not good at this. I made a bad decision. I shouldn't have tried. And that story stops everything, because once you label yourself, you limit yourself. And this is exactly why most people never move forward financially. Not because they lack opportunity, but because they fear missteps. They want certainty. They want guarantees. They want to avoid discomfort completely. But here's the truth. There is no growth without friction. There is no progress without adjustment. There is no expansion without error. And once you accept that, you stop fearing mistakes. You start using them. Now let's bring this into the world of money, because this is where the fear becomes real. One wrong decision, one bad move, one miscalculation, and people feel like everything is at risk. So what do? They freeze, they delay, they avoid. And in that avoidance, they stay exactly where they are, safe, but stuck. Now contrast that with someone who understands the game. They don't aim to be perfect. They aim to be adaptive. They know mistakes will happen, but they don't let those mistakes define them. They use them. They study them. They extract lessons from them, and then they move again. That's the difference. One person stops at the mistake, the other grows through it. Now here's where it connects to everything you've learned so far. When you begin using credit, when you begin leveraging, when you begin building systems, you will not get everything right the first time. And that's not failure, that's feedback. Because every decision gives you data. Every action shows you something. Every result teaches you where to adjust. But only if you're willing to see it that way. Because most people don't analyze their mistakes. They avoid them, they ignore them, they bury them, and in doing so, they repeat them. That's the real cost. Not the mistake itself, but the failure to learn from it. Now let's make this practical. You make a financial decision. It doesn't go exactly as planned. What happens next? A reactive person feels regret. They shut down. They hesitate. They lose confidence. But a strategic person does something different. They pause. They evaluate. They ask, what did I miss? What can I adjust? What did this teach me? And that reflection becomes an advantage because now they're operating with more awareness than before. Now they're sharper, more precise, more prepared. That's how progress actually works, not through perfection, but through refinement. Now here's a powerful truth most people never realize. The people who win financially are not the ones who avoid mistakes. They are the ones who recover faster. They don't stay stuck in analysis. They don't dwell on regret. They adjust quickly and move again. That speed of recovery is what separates growth from stagnation, because time matters. Momentum matters. And if you spend too long stuck in hesitation, you lose both. Now let's connect this to fear again, because fear is not always obvious. Sometimes it shows up quietly, as overthinking, as delay, as waiting for the right moment. But underneath it all, it's the same thing. Avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort. Avoidance of uncertainty. Avoidance of potential failure. And that avoidance is what keeps people from ever stepping into control. Because control requires action. And action requires courage. Not blind courage, but informed courage. The kind that says, I may not get this perfect, but I will learn and adjust. And that mindset changes everything. Because now you are no longer trying to avoid mistakes. You are building resilience. You are building awareness. You are building the ability to navigate instead of hide. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. Mistakes don't destroy your progress. They accelerate it if you're willing to learn. And once you truly understand that, fear loses its power. Because now, every step forward, even imperfect ones, moves you closer to control. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your mindset becomes stronger. You're no longer fragile. You're adaptable. You're no longer afraid to move. You're prepared to adjust. And that's what allows you to step into the next level. Because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about something even more important than knowledge: execution. Because understanding everything means nothing if you never apply it consistently. And this is where most people fall behind. Not in what they know, but in what they actually do. Chapter 11, Execution, where everything either breaks or builds. There is a silent gap that destroys more potential than failure ever could. It's not lack of knowledge. It's not lack of opportunity. It's not even lack of resources. It's the gap between knowing and doing. And most people live in that gap. They learn, they watch. They understand, but they don't execute. Or they execute once, then stop. Or they execute inconsistently and wonder why nothing changes. Because here's the truth most people avoid. Consistency is more powerful than intensity, and execution is where consistency lives. Now let's slow this down, because execution is not about doing everything perfectly. It's about doing the right things repeatedly, even when it's boring, even when it's uncomfortable, even when there's no immediate reward. That's where real progress happens, in the quiet repetition of disciplined action. Now think about everything you've learned so far. Credit as a tool, leverage, cash flow, mindset, systems. All of it is useless without execution, because information does not change your life. Application does. And this is where most people fall apart. Not because they don't understand the strategy, but because they don't stay with it long enough. They start strong, motivated, focused, clear, But then something happens. They get distracted. They lose discipline. They fall back into old habits. And slowly, without realizing it, they return to the same patterns. That's the cycle. And breaking that cycle requires something deeper than motivation. It requires commitment. Now here's the difference. Motivation is emotional. It comes and goes. Commitment is structural. It stays even when emotions change. And execution is built on commitment. Not how you feel, but what you do regardless of how you feel. Now let's make this practical. You decide to use your credit card as a tool. You build a system. You track your spending. You categorize everything. You stay disciplined. That's execution. Not once, not occasionally, but consistently. Because consistency compounds. And over time, small disciplined actions create massive results. Now here's where it gets real. Because execution is not tested when things are easy. It's tested when things feel inconvenient, when you're tired, when you're distracted, when you don't feel like thinking. That's when your system either holds or breaks. And if it breaks, you don't blame yourself. You adjust the system, because strong systems reduce reliance on willpower, and weak systems depend on it. That's a critical difference, because willpower fades, but structure remains. Now let's connect this back to money. Most people fail financially, not because they make one big mistake, but because they make small, undisciplined decisions repeatedly. A swipe here, a delay there, a justification somewhere in between. And over time, those small decisions create large consequences. But the reverse is also true. Small, disciplined decisions, repeated consistently, create powerful outcomes. That's how control is built. Not through one big moment, but through daily execution. Now here's the deeper truth. Execution is not about forcing yourself. It's about aligning your actions with your identity. Because when you see yourself as someone who is disciplined, execution becomes natural. When you see yourself as someone who is intentional, execution becomes automatic. And that's why identity matters so much, because it drives behavior. Now here's a question you need to ask yourself. Am I someone who understands or someone who executes? Because understanding feels productive, but execution creates results. And results are what change your life. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. You don't rise to the level of your knowledge. You fall to the level of your execution. And once you accept that, you stop chasing information. You start building discipline. You stop waiting for clarity. You start taking action. And that's where everything shifts. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your growth becomes real. You're no longer just learning. You're becoming more focused, more intentional, more controlled, and that transformation is what sets you apart. But there's still another layer. Because even with execution, even with discipline, even with systems, there is one factor that can either accelerate everything or quietly destroy it: your environment. And in the next chapter, we're going to break that open, because who you surround yourself with and what you expose yourself to daily will either reinforce your growth or pull you back into old patterns. And most people underestimate just how powerful that is. Chapter 12, Environment, the Invisible Force, Shaping Your Financial Life. You can have the right strategy. You can have the right mindset, the right tools, the right intentions, and still end up exactly where you started. Why? Because of something most people underestimate: their environment. not just where they live, but what they see daily, what they hear repeatedly, what they normalize without realizing it. Because environment is not loud. It doesn't force you. It influences you quietly, consistently, relentlessly, and over time, it shapes your decisions. Now think about this. If you are surrounded by people who spend impulsively, who treat money emotionally, who normalize debt as survival, what do you think becomes normal to you? The same patterns, the same reactions, the same outcomes, not because you chose them consciously, but because you absorbed them. That's how environment works. Now flip that. If you are exposed to people who think strategically, who manage money intentionally, who use systems instead of emotion, what happens? Your thinking begins to shift. Your standards begin to rise. Your decisions begin to change, because what you see repeatedly becomes what you accept, and what you accept becomes what you act on. That's the chain. Now here's where it becomes even more important, because in today's world, your environment is not just physical, it's digital. What you scroll, what you watch, what you listen to every day, because every piece of content is either reinforcing discipline or feeding distraction. There is no neutral, and if your environment is filled with noise, comparison, impulse, short-term thinking, it becomes harder to stay focused, harder to stay intentional, harder to execute, not because you're weak, but because you're constantly being pulled. Now here's the truth most people avoid. You cannot build a disciplined life in a chaotic environment. You cannot think long-term if everything around you pushes short-term rewards. And you cannot use money strategically if you're constantly being triggered emotionally. So what do? You don't wait for your environment to change. You design it. That's control. Now let's make this practical. You begin by reducing noise, not completely removing everything, but becoming intentional about what you allow in. You stop feeding your mind with things that weaken your focus. You limit exposure to distractions that trigger impulse. You create space for clarity. Now you replace what you remove with input that strengthens you, not hype, not empty motivation, but ideas that reinforce discipline, that sharpen your thinking, that remind you of where you're going. Because consistency in what you consume creates consistency in how you think, and how you think drives how you act. Now let's connect this back to money, because this is where it becomes real. If your environment constantly pushes consumption, you will feel the urge to spend. If your environment glorifies lifestyle, you will feel pressure to keep up. If your environment normalizes financial chaos, you will struggle to build control. But if you shift your environment, even slightly, everything becomes easier, not effortless, but aligned. Because now your surroundings support your direction instead of fighting against it. Now here's the deeper layer. Environment is not just external, it's internal. Your habits, your routines, your daily structure, because what you do every day becomes your personal environment. And if your daily actions are scattered, your results will be scattered. But if your actions are structured, your results begin to align. That's where execution meets environment. Now here's a question you need to ask yourself honestly. Is my environment supporting my growth or slowing it down? Because the answer to that question explains more than you think. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. You don't just live in your environment. You become it. And once you understand that, you stop leaving it to chance. You start shaping it intentionally. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your awareness deepens again. You're not just working on your finances. You're working on your surroundings, your inputs, your patterns, and that level of control is what allows everything else to stick. But there's still another layer, because even with the right environment, even with execution, even with discipline, there is one thing that quietly determines your long-term outcome: time. And in the next chapter, we're going to break down how time interacts with money and why most people completely underestimate its power. Because once you understand that, you stop chasing fast results and start building something that compounds. Dear friend, allow me to interrupt for a moment. Our team is currently working on improving our channel and videos. May we ask you, dear viewer, what you like about our videos, or perhaps what you would like to see in our videos? Perhaps a different video format, or a different format for presenting audiobooks. Be skeptical. Your skeptical expert opinion can help us improve our videos even more. Thank you very much. We look forward to your comments under the video. Let's continue. Chapter 13, Time, the force that multiplies everything. Most people think money is the most powerful resource they have. They protect it. They chase it. They measure their life by it. But money is not the most powerful force in your financial life. Time is, because money can be lost and regained. Time only moves in one direction, and once it passes, it's gone. But here's where it gets deeper. Time doesn't just pass, it compounds. And that's what most people never truly understand. Because compounding is not just about interest, it's about repetition over time. It's about what happens when small actions are sustained consistently. Now let's connect this to everything you've learned. When you use money emotionally, time works against you. Debt grows, pressure builds, opportunities shrink. But when you use money strategically, time works for you. Systems grow, cash flow builds, leverage expands. Same time, different outcome. And that difference is everything. Now think about this. Two people start at the same point. Same income, same opportunities. But one makes small disciplined decisions daily, tracks spending, uses credit intentionally, builds systems slowly. The other acts emotionally, spends without structure, avoids planning, lives reactively. At first, the difference is invisible. You can't see it. They look the same. But over time, that gap widens, because time amplifies patterns, not intentions. Patterns. And that's why consistency matters so much, because consistency gives time something to multiply. Now here's where most people go wrong. They underestimate slow progress. They want fast results, immediate change, quick wins, instant transformation. And when they don't see it, they stop. They assume it's not working, but the truth is, the most powerful changes are invisible at the beginning. They build quietly, under the surface, until one day they become undeniable. That's compounding. Now let's bring this back to debt and leverage, because this is where time becomes critical. If you use debt emotionally, time magnifies the damage. Interest builds, stress increases, options decrease. But if you use debt strategically, time magnifies the advantage. Assets grow, cash flow improves, control expands. And that's why the same tool can create completely different outcomes, because time is always working. The question is it working for you or against you. Now here's the deeper realization. You cannot rush compounding. You cannot force it. You can only feed it with consistency, with discipline, with intentional action, and over time, it builds. Now here's something powerful. Most people waste time trying to find the perfect strategy, but the perfect strategy means nothing without time. And a simple strategy, executed consistently over time, becomes powerful. That's the shift. You don't need complexity, you need consistency. Now ask yourself, what am I giving time to multiply in my life? Because whatever that answer is, that's your future. If you're giving time to distraction, you're multiplying stagnation. If you're giving time to discipline, you're multiplying growth. If you're giving time to chaos, you're multiplying pressure. Time doesn't judge, it amplifies. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. Time will either expose your lack of discipline or reward your consistency. And once you understand that, you stop chasing shortcuts. You start building systems. You stop looking for quick wins. You start creating long-term advantage. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your thinking matures. You're no longer trying to get rich quick. You're building something that lasts, something that grows, even when you're not actively thinking about it. And that's power. But there's still one more layer, because even with time, even with consistency, even with systems, there is something that determines how fast you move. Speed of decision. And in the next chapter, we're going to break down why some people stay stuck for years, while others move forward quickly with the same information. Because it's not about what they know, it's about how they decide. Chapter 14. The speed of decision, where most people lose years. There is a silent cost most people never calculate. It's not interest. It's not inflation. It's not even bad investments. It's hesitation. Because while you are thinking, waiting, overanalyzing, time is still moving, opportunities are still shifting, and life is still progressing without you. Now understand this clearly. The difference between people who grow and people who stay stuck is not intelligence. It's not access. It's not even knowledge. It's speed of decision. Because knowledge without decision is paralysis, and paralysis kills momentum. Now let's go deeper. Most people believe they are being careful. They say, I just need more information. I want to make the right move. I don't want to make a mistake. But underneath all of that is fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing. Fear of uncertainty. And that fear slows them down. They wait for clarity that never fully comes. They wait for confidence they haven't built yet. They wait for the perfect moment. And while they wait, nothing changes. Now contrast that with someone who understands this principle. They don't rush blindly, but they also don't freeze. They gather enough information, then they decide, and once they decide, they move. Not perfectly, but decisively, because they understand something powerful. Clarity comes from action, not before it, and that shift alone changes everything. Now let's connect this to your financial life, because this is where hesitation becomes expensive. You hesitate to track your money. You delay building systems. You wait to use tools. You postpone learning how to leverage. And every delay pushes your progress further away, not dramatically, but consistently, and consistency is what compounds. Now here's the deeper truth. Every time you delay a decision, you are making a decision to stay the same, a decision to remain where you are, a decision to let time pass without progress. And that's the part most people never realize. Inaction is still action. It just moves you in the opposite direction. Now here's where it becomes even more important, because when you begin to understand leverage, when you begin to understand systems, timing becomes critical. Opportunities don't wait forever. Conditions change. Windows close. And the people who benefit are not always the smartest. They are the ones who move when it matters. Now let's make this practical. You don't need perfect clarity to start using your credit card as a tool. You need enough clarity to build a simple system. You don't need complete certainty to begin tracking cash flow. You need enough awareness to begin observing. You don't need guaranteed outcomes to start thinking strategically. You need willingness to learn and adjust. That's how movement begins, not from perfection, but from decision. Now here's the key. Fast decision-making does not mean reckless action. It means reducing unnecessary delay. It means trusting your ability to adjust. It means understanding that progress is built through movement. Now think about this. How many times have you known what to do, but didn't do it? Not because you couldn't, but because you hesitated, because you overthought, because you waited. That gap between knowing and doing is where most potential disappears. And closing that gap is what changes everything. Now here's a powerful shift. Instead of asking, what if this goes wrong? Start asking, what happens if I stay the same? Because staying the same has a cost. A silent one, a slow one, but a real one. And once you see that, you stop fearing action. You start fearing stagnation. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. You don't lose in life because you make wrong decisions. You lose because you delay the right ones. And once you understand that, you begin to move differently, with more urgency, more clarity, more intention. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your momentum begins to build. You're no longer stuck in thinking. You're stepping into action. You're no longer waiting for perfect conditions. You're creating movement. And that movement is what creates progress. But there's still another layer, because even with fast decisions, even with execution, even with systems, there is something that determines whether you sustain growth or fall back. Emotional control. And in the next chapter, we're going to break that down, because money is not just logical, it's emotional. And if you don't learn to manage that, it will quietly undo everything you've built. Chapter 15, Emotional Control. The silent factor behind every financial decision. Money looks logical on the surface. Numbers, balances, percentages, systems. It feels structured, predictable. But underneath, money is emotional. Every decision you make with money is influenced by how you feel, not just what you know. And this is where most people lose control, not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack emotional discipline. Let's go deeper. You don't overspend because you don't understand math. You overspend because of how you feel in the moment. Stress, boredom, excitement, comparison. Those emotions drive action. And when action is driven by emotion, it loses structure. Now think about this. How many times have you made a financial decision that felt right in the moment, but later you questioned it? That's emotional influence, and it happens quietly, because emotions don't announce themselves. They justify themselves. This is fine. I deserve this. It's not a big deal, and in the moment, it feels true. But over time, those small emotional decisions create large consequences. Now here's the deeper truth. You cannot remove emotion from money, but you can learn to manage it. And that is where control begins. Because emotional control is not about suppressing how you feel. It's about not letting those feelings dictate your decisions. It's about creating space between impulse and action. Now let's connect this to everything you've learned. You have systems, you have structure, you have awareness. But in a moment of emotion, all of that can disappear if you're not grounded. That's why emotional control is the foundation of everything. Because without it, even the best strategy fails. Now let's make this practical. You feel the urge to spend, not because you need something, but because something triggered you. What do? Most people act immediately. They swipe, they justify, they move on. But a controlled person does something different. They pause. That pause is power. Because in that pause, you create awareness. You ask, why am I doing this? Does this serve me? Is this aligned with my system? And in that moment, you regain control. Now here's the key. You don't need to eliminate impulse. You need to delay it. Because impulse loses strength over time. What feels urgent now often feels unnecessary later. That's emotional decay. And learning to wait allows logic to return. Now here's where it becomes even more important, because emotional decisions are not always obvious. Sometimes they show up as fear. Fear of missing out. Fear of losing opportunity. Fear of being left behind. And that fear can push you into decisions that are not aligned. You rush. You skip steps. You act without clarity. And that's just as dangerous as impulsive spending. Because, again, emotion overrides structure. Now here's the shift you need to make. You stop making decisions in emotional states, not permanently, but intentionally. If you feel triggered, you wait. If you feel rushed, you slow down. If you feel pressured, you step back. Because strong decisions come from clarity, not urgency. Now here's something powerful. Emotional control is not built in big moments. It's built in small ones. Every time you pause instead of reacting, you strengthen it. Every time you choose discipline over impulse, you reinforce it. Every time you stay aligned with your system, you build it. And over time, it becomes natural. Now here's the deeper realization. Money doesn't test your intelligence. It tests your discipline. It tests your patience. It tests your emotional stability. And if those are weak, your results will reflect it. But if those are strong, everything begins to align. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. You don't lose control of money because of what you know. You lose it because of how you feel in the moment. And once you understand that, you stop focusing only on strategy. You start mastering yourself. Now pause for a moment, because this is where everything connects. Mindset, systems, execution, environment, time. All of it depends on your ability to stay controlled when it matters most. And that's what separates those who build from those who repeat cycles. But there's still another layer, because once you have control, once you have discipline, once you have awareness, you step into something even more powerful, ownership. And in the next chapter, we're going to break that down. Because ownership is not just about assets, it's about responsibility. And once you take full ownership of your financial life, everything changes. If you enjoy these audiobooks and want to support the channel, consider joining our private members community. Members get early access to new audiobooks and exclusive wealth lessons. Chapter 16. Ownership, the moment everything becomes yours. There is a moment in every person's life where everything changes, not externally, not visibly, not overnight, but internally, quietly, decisively. It's the moment you stop blaming and start owning. Because until that moment happens, nothing truly shifts. You can learn strategies. You can build systems. You can understand money. But if you don't take ownership, you will always find a way to give your power away. Now let's be honest. It's easy to blame the economy, the system, your past, your circumstances, and sometimes those things are real. They create obstacles. They create pressure. They create limitations. But they do not define your outcome. Your response does. And that's where ownership lives. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. As long as you believe something else is in control, you will never fully step into control yourself. Because blame feels relieving. It takes responsibility off your shoulders, but it also takes power away from your hands. And without power, nothing changes. Now think about this. If your financial situation is not where you want it to be, what is your first reaction? Do you look outward or inward? Because that answer determines everything. Now let's go deeper. Ownership is not about guilt. It's not about blaming yourself. It's about responsibility. It's about saying, this is where I am, and I am responsible for where I go next. That's it. Not shame, not regret. Just clarity. And that clarity is what gives you power. Because once you own your position, you can change it. But if you deny it, avoid it, blame it, you stay stuck in it. Now let's connect this to money, because this is where it becomes real. Ownership means you know your numbers, not vaguely, not approximately, clearly. You know what you earn. You know what you spend. You know what you owe. Because avoiding those numbers does not remove them. It only removes your control over them. Now here's something most people avoid. Looking at their financial reality feels uncomfortable. It brings up emotion. It brings up pressure. It brings up truth. But that discomfort is temporary. The clarity it brings is permanent. And clarity is what allows you to move forward. Now, ownership goes beyond numbers. It extends to decisions. Every financial decision you've made led you to where you are. That's not a judgment. That's awareness. And awareness is what allows change. Because if your decisions created your current situation, your new decisions can create a different one. That's power. That's control. Now here's the shift. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you start asking, what can I do about it? That question alone changes your entire trajectory, because now you're not passive, you're active. Now you're not waiting, you're moving. Now let's go even deeper. Ownership is not just about fixing problems. It's about creating direction. It's about deciding where you're going, what you're building, what your financial life is going to look like. Because without direction, you drift. And drifting leads to repetition. The same patterns, the same outcomes, the same frustrations. But when you take ownership, you create intention. And intention leads to change. Now here's where it connects to everything. When you own your finances, you build systems. When you own your decisions, you build discipline. When you own your mindset, you build awareness. And all of that leads to control. Now here's a powerful realization. Ownership is not a one-time decision. It's a daily practice. Every day you choose to take responsibility, to stay aware, to stay intentional, and over time, that builds something strong, something stable, something that cannot be easily shaken. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. The moment you take full ownership is the moment you take full control. And once you feel that, everything changes. Because now, you are no longer reacting to life. You are directing it. Now pause for a moment, because this is where everything becomes real. You're no longer learning concepts. You're stepping into responsibility. You're no longer waiting for change. You're creating it. And that shift is what separates those who stay stuck from those who move forward. But there's still another layer. Because once you take ownership, once you build control, once you understand the system, you step into something even more powerful. Expansion at scale. And in the next chapter, we're going to break down how the wealthy multiply their position, not slowly, but strategically, because this is where leverage becomes a system. Chapter 17, Scaling, how the wealthy multiply without starting over. Most people think growth is about doing more effort, more hours, more hustle. They believe if they just push harder, they will eventually get ahead. And for a while, that works. You earn more, you improve, you stabilize. But then something happens. You hit a ceiling, because effort alone does not scale. And this is where the next shift begins. From growth to multiplication. Because the wealthy don't just grow, they scale. And scaling is not about doing more work. It's about building systems that produce more without requiring more of you. Now let's slow this down, because this is where most people get confused. They think scaling requires something massive, a big business, a huge investment, perfect conditions. But scaling is not about size. It's about structure. It's about creating something that can expand without constant input. Now let's connect this to everything you've learned. You understand credit. You understand leverage. You understand cash flow. Now instead of using these tools to survive or even just stabilize, you begin using them to multiply. That's the shift. Now here's how it works conceptually. At the beginning, you trade time for money. That's the entry point. Then you learn to manage money. That's control. Then you learn to direct money. That's strategy. And finally, you learn to multiply money. That's scaling. Each stage builds on the last. And you cannot skip steps, because scaling without control creates collapse. Now here's the key principle. You do not scale chaos. You scale structure. If your system is weak, scaling will amplify the weakness. If your system is strong, scaling will amplify the results. That's why foundation matters so much. Now let's bring this into reality. You build something that produces. It generates income. It creates flow. Now instead of consuming that flow, you reinvest it. You expand it. You use leverage to increase its reach. And slowly, that single stream becomes multiple. That's scaling, not starting over, but building on top. Now here's what most people do wrong. They start something, then jump to something new, then something else. They chase opportunity instead of building systems. And as a result, nothing compounds, nothing scales, everything stays fragmented. But the strategic thinker does something different. They focus. They build one system until it becomes stable. Then they expand it. Then they multiply it. And over time, that focus creates exponential growth. Now here's the deeper truth. Scaling requires patience, because at the beginning, it doesn't look impressive. It looks slow. It looks small. It looks like nothing is happening. But underneath, structure is forming. And once that structure is strong, growth accelerates. Now let's connect this back to debt, because this is where advanced thinking comes in. At the beginning, debt helps you enter. It gives you access. It allows you to start. But at the scaling level, debt becomes a multiplier. You use it to expand what already works, not to guess, not to experiment blindly, but to amplify proven systems. That's the difference. Because once something is validated, leverage accelerates it. Now here's the question you need to ask yourself. Am I trying to do more? Or am I trying to build something that does more? Because those are not the same. And most people stay stuck because they focus on effort instead of structure. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. You don't build wealth by working more. You build it by creating systems that work more than you do. And once you understand that, you stop chasing activity. You start building assets. You stop relying on effort. You start designing systems. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your thinking reaches another level. You're no longer focused on survival. You're no longer just managing life. You're building something that grows even when you step back. And that's power. But there's still another layer, because even with scaling, even with systems, even with leverage, there is one thing that determines whether you keep what you build or lose it: protection. And in the next chapter, we're going to break down how to protect your position so that everything you build actually lasts. Because building wealth is only half the game. Keeping it is the other half. Chapter 18, Protection: Why Most People Lose What They Build. Most people focus on making money. They think that's the goal: to earn more, to grow faster, to expand. And for a while, that feels like progress. But here's the truth most people learn too late. Making money is only half the game. Keeping it is the other half. And most people never learn that second part. Because building feels exciting. It feels like movement, like growth, like success. But protection? It feels slow. It feels cautious. It feels unnecessary until it's too late. Now, let's go deeper, because this is where many people lose everything they worked for, not because they didn't know how to build, but because they didn't know how to protect. They scale too fast. They take on too much risk. They ignore structure, and eventually everything collapses, not instantly, but gradually, because instability is quiet at first. Now here's the key understanding. Protection is not about fear. It's about stability. It's about making sure what you build can withstand pressure. Because pressure is inevitable. Markets shift, opportunities change, unexpected situations happen. And if your foundation is weak, those moments expose it. But if your structure is strong, those moments don't break you. They test you, and you hold. Now let's connect this to everything. You've learned about leverage. You've learned about using debt. You've learned about scaling. But here's the truth. Leverage without protection becomes dangerous, because leverage amplifies. It amplifies growth, but it also amplifies risk. So if you expand without structure, you create vulnerability, and that vulnerability eventually catches up. Now here's where most people go wrong. They get excited when things start working. They see progress. They feel momentum. And instead of strengthening their foundation, they push further, faster, bigger, more aggressive. And in doing so, they expose themselves, because growth without protection is unstable. Now let's make this practical. Protection starts with awareness. You always know your position, not roughly, not approximately. Clearly, you know your obligations, you know your risks, you know your margins. Because if you don't see your position clearly, you cannot protect it. Now here's the next layer. You don't stretch yourself to the limit, even if you can. Because operating at maximum capacity leaves no room for error, and life always introduces error. So instead, you create space, margin, flexibility, because flexibility is what allows you to adapt. Now here's another key. You don't rely on one system, one source, one structure, one flow, because dependency creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates risk. So as you grow, you diversify. Not randomly, but strategically, you build multiple supports, so that if one shifts, everything doesn't collapse. Now here's the deeper realization. Protection is not about avoiding growth. It's about sustaining it. Because fast growth that disappears is not success. It's illusion. Real success lasts. Now let's bring this back to mindset. Because protection requires discipline. It requires restraint. The ability to say, I could push further, but I choose to stabilize first. And that's hard, because ambition pushes you forward, but discipline keeps you grounded, and you need both. Now here's a powerful truth. The people who build lasting wealth are not the ones who grow the fastest. They are the ones who remain the longest, because time rewards stability. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. It's not what you build that defines your future. It's what you can keep. And once you understand that, you stop chasing fast growth. You start building strong foundations. You stop taking unnecessary risks. You start managing intelligent ones. Now pause for a moment, because this is where everything balances. Growth and protection, expansion and stability, ambition and discipline. And when those are aligned, you build something real, something sustainable, something that lasts. But there's still another layer, because even with protection, even with systems, even with structure, there is one final shift that separates those who succeed temporarily from those who create true financial freedom. Perspective. And in the next chapter, we're going to bring everything together, because once your perspective changes completely, you no longer play the game the same way. You see it differently, you move differently, and most importantly, you win differently. Chapter 19, Perspective, the shift that changes the entire game. There comes a point where nothing new is added, no new strategy, no new tool, no new concept, and yet everything changes, not because you learned more, but because you see differently. That's perspective, and perspective is what separates information from transformation, because two people can hear the same knowledge and walk away with completely different results. Why? Because they interpret it differently. They see it differently, they apply it differently. Now let's go deeper. Up until now, you've been learning how the system works. Credit, debt, leverage, cash flow, discipline, execution. But perspective is what connects all of it. Because without the right perspective, you will misuse everything you've learned. Now here's the shift. Most people see money as something external, something they chase, something they earn, something they try to hold on to. But that perspective keeps them reactive, because they are always responding to money. Now shift that. You begin to see money as something you direct, something you position, something you control. And instantly, your role changes. You're no longer reacting. You're leading. That's perspective. Now here's where it becomes powerful. You stop asking, how do I make more money? And you start asking, how do I use money more effectively? Because earning more without structure leads to the same problems, just on a bigger scale. But using money effectively creates control at any level. Now here's another shift. You stop seeing debt as something to avoid and start seeing it as something to understand, not blindly, not recklessly, but intelligently, because avoidance creates ignorance, and ignorance creates fear. But understanding creates control. Now let's go even deeper. You stop seeing banks as authority and start seeing them as systems. Systems that operate on rules, predictable rules, learnable rules. And once you understand those rules, you stop feeling controlled. You start interacting strategically. Now here's the biggest shift of all. You stop thinking short term, not occasionally, but consistently. You stop making decisions based on immediate comfort and start making them based on long-term positioning. Because once you truly understand time, you realize something powerful. Short-term thinking creates long-term problems. Long-term thinking creates short-term discipline, but long-term freedom. That's the trade, and most people choose the opposite. Now here's where everything comes together. You are no longer just someone trying to get ahead. You are someone building structure. You are someone creating systems. You are someone directing outcomes. And that identity changes everything, because now you don't chase opportunities. You recognize them. You don't react to money. You control it. You don't fear the system. You understand it. And once you reach that point, you are no longer playing the same game. Now here's the line that defines this chapter. When your perspective changes, the same system that once limited you becomes the system that elevates you. And that's the moment everything shifts. Now pause for a moment, because this is where awareness becomes power. You're no longer confused. You're no longer reacting. You're seeing clearly. And clarity is what allows you to move with confidence. But there's still one final step, because understanding, perspective, systems, discipline, all of it leads to one question. What do you do now? And in the next chapter, we bring everything together into action. Because this is not just about learning, it's about becoming. Chapter 20, the decision, becoming the person who uses the system. This is where everything becomes real, not in theory, not in ideas, not in understanding, but in decision. Because after everything you've heard, after every shift in mindset, every layer of awareness, every principle you now understand, there is only one question left. What are you going to do with it? Because information does not change your life. Decision does. And decision is what separates those who listen from those who transform. Now let's slow this down, because this moment matters more than you think. You've seen the truth about debt. You've seen the difference between consumption and control. You've seen how leverage works, how cash flow moves, how systems build, how discipline shapes outcomes. You've seen it. But seeing is not enough, because the world is full of people who understand and still stay exactly where they are, not because they can't change, but because they don't decide to. And that's the truth most people avoid. Change is not blocked by lack of knowledge. It's delayed by lack of commitment. Now here's the shift. You stop asking, what should I do? And you start asking, who do I need to become? Because everything you've learned requires a version of you that acts differently, more aware, more disciplined, more intentional. And that version is not built in one moment. It's built through decisions, daily, consistent, non-negotiable decisions. Now let's make this practical. You don't need to change everything overnight. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need ideal conditions. You need one thing, a starting point, one decision that moves you forward. Maybe it's tracking your money. Maybe it's building a simple credit system. Maybe it's changing how you think about spending. It doesn't matter where you start. What matters is that you start. Because movement creates clarity, and clarity creates momentum. Now here's the truth. At first, nothing will feel dramatic. No big breakthrough, no instant transformation, just small changes, small decisions, small shifts. But over time, those small actions compound, and one day you look back and realize everything is different. That's how real change happens. Quietly, consistently, powerfully. Now here's the deeper realization. You are not trying to beat the system. You are learning to use it. You are learning how it works, so you can position yourself inside it, strategically, intentionally, and that changes everything, because now you're no longer at the mercy of money. You're directing it. Now here's a question you need to sit with, not quickly, not lightly, but honestly. Are you ready to take control? Not partially, not temporarily, but fully, because control requires responsibility. It requires discipline. It requires awareness. But it also brings something powerful. Freedom. Not instant freedom. Not easy freedom. But real freedom. The kind that is built. The kind that lasts. Now here's the final line of this journey. The one that ties everything together. The moment you stop reacting to money and start directing it is the moment you step into real power. And that moment is available to you right now. Not someday, not later, not when things are perfect, now. So here's what I want you to do. Make this personal. If something in this audiobook resonated with you, don't let it pass. Commit to one action, one shift, one decision that moves you forward. And if you're serious about this journey, then make it visible, not for validation, but for accountability. Write it down, say it out loud, or share it in the comments. What is the one thing you are going to change starting today? Because when you declare it, you strengthen it. And if this audiobook gave you clarity, if it shifted your perspective, if it made you think differently, then treat that as a contract with yourself, a commitment to grow, a commitment to act. And if you want to keep building this mindset, stay connected, because consistency is what turns awareness into transformation. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it sounds good, but because it might change how they see their life. And sometimes, one shift in perspective is all it takes. Now take a breath and realize something important. You are not behind. You are not stuck. You are at a point of awareness. And awareness is where everything begins. Your next step is yours to take, and the system is no longer something to fear. It's something you now understand. And once you understand it, you can use it. And once you use it, you can build with it. And once you build with it, you can change everything. This is your starting point. Now move.